Would you turn to Nehemiah chapter 2, please? Nehemiah chapter 2. One of the great joys of being a young boy is when you get to build a fort. And they start when they're little, you put blankets over the chairs, right? And you're crawling around in there, and that's a fort. And your mind begins to go, your imagination. And tree forts are something that we think about, and it doesn't take a lot of materials. It just takes a lot of imagination to think of all kinds of adventures and forts and stuff. So when I was 8 years old, my family moved to a new location. It was in a suburb of Youngstown, but behind us was about a 20-acre field that became this great playground for my brother and I and a handful of friends from the neighborhood. And we roamed that field back there. We dominated that field back there, I want you to know. And, around the time I was 11 years old, so a couple years later, some construction equipment began to roll in, and they put a couple streets in and began to build houses. So it was cramping our style, but we tried to do the best we could. So we began to gather materials from the scrap piles of the houses that they were building. And my brother and I put together one of the finest pieces of real estate that you'd ever want to buy. If you know a real estate salesman, take a look at our, that's 3 stories. I don't know what you're laughing at. There's lap siding on that thing. So my future engineer brother was 9 years old in that photo, and I was 11. And we engineered, each story was a pallet in height. So pallets are kind of heavy. Can you picture the 9-year-old and 11-year-old dragging pallets across that field that you see there in the background and then raising that structure up? We couldn't have done that by ourselves. It took he and I working together. We had a rope ladder climbing up the side. There's a lookout at the top. Every floor had rooms that you could go in and just imagine things. I don't know what we did with it. But I know one of the things I learned was that you can't hardly put a nail in a piece of oak because those pallets, and I remember pounding and thinking, man, my dad's carpenters put nails in a lot faster than that. Speaking of my dad, let me offer a disclaimer here. He'd want all of you to know that he had absolutely nothing to do with that building project. He didn't even come out and inspect it too often. So one day, that picture was taken in April, so we enjoyed it all through the summer, and it got to leaning even worse than what it was there in April. And so he decided that our leaning Tower of Pisa needed to be put out of its misery. He's like, we're going to burn that thing here. It's the end of the summer. You're going back to school, and we're going to roast some hot dogs out there at the bonfire. So he pulls it down, and he douses it with gasoline, I guess, something, because it lit up. And I remember just running around the yard crazy because we had this massive bonfire going. Now, in our little suburb there, we didn't have a tornado siren. We had a fire siren. But it sounded just like what the tornado sirens do around here. And the fire siren was to summon all the volunteers that within earshot. They didn't all carry radios like they do now. Summon all the volunteers within earshot to come to whatever the call was. So we were already running around crazy when the fire siren goes off. And we're just like, they're coming here. This is getting better yet. So we're just running around crazy. And I remember I ran to the front of the house, and here comes a fire truck up the street. And then I run to the back, just bouncing like a kid. And here comes a fire truck driving through the field that you see there. And my dad, I clarified a couple details this week. I said, Dad, what were you doing? He said, I was on the phone trying to call off the fire trucks. And they said, we can't turn them back. We have to show up if we get a call. Across that field, it looked like some house was on fire because this thing was so big. And the flames were higher than the trees, according to the dispatcher there. So they put the fire out. And my dad just kept grinning the rest of the night. All I wanted to do was cook a few hot dogs. All I wanted to do was cook a few hot dogs. And so our 3-story lap siding, grand building design didn't survive for long. We're talking about the book of Nehemiah here. That little building project reminds us that two people working together can accomplish more than two people working separately. So our series for this month, We Can Do More Together, taken from the book of Nehemiah. And it's the book of Nehemiah. We learned a couple of things from the book last week. One is we learned that it helps us to name what's broken. We can't really fix anything until we know what's broken. And for Nehemiah, he learned that the walls of Jerusalem were broken down. The people were discouraged. Nobody had the energy or the resources or the thought to, hey, maybe we should build up the wall again. Maybe we should gather up the rubble and clean up the place. Nobody did that for 140 years. They just got used to it the way it was. It was all of this brokenness around them. And we live in a culture with a lot of brokenness around us. This past week, it was in the news that the 6 school superintendents for Johnson County were getting together and we're going to start holding monthly meetings with other leaders from the community related to the issue of suicide. Teen suicide is the second leading cause of death among young people. And every district in Johnson County, these superintendents were saying, has been touched directly by this dreadful discouragement that so many people are dealing with. Emotional distress and depression and alcohol and drug abuse, family brokenness. It's not uncommon for me to come back to the office and say to the staff, we've got to figure this out. The level of brokenness that exists in our world. We've got to figure this out. We can't just be glad that most of the seats in the building are full. There's a level of brokenness in our world that only the message of Christ, the gospel of Jesus Christ, can alter the trajectory of these young lives. So I'm glad that Jacob is creating a training class for the youth ministry volunteers here in the near future related to suicide, because it's a symptom, as it's a growing trend, it's a symptom of the brokenness and emptiness that exists in our world. We're going to begin here in a couple of weeks a grief support group, something that we've convened in past years, but we're going to try to draw grieving folks together again, beginning Thursday, the 23rd of August. Again, as a way to address some of the hurt and the brokenness that exists in our world. That's what Nehemiah did. He saw this brokenness and he said, I can't go on without doing something about it. And I want us to be that kind of church that says we can't go on without doing something about the brokenness that exists in our world. We also learned last week to leverage what it is that we have. The end of chapter 1 in Nehemiah, he says, I was a cupbearer for the king. He didn't have a lot of duties. He didn't have a grand construction background. He didn't have a religious leadership kind of role. He was the king's cupbearer, the wine taster, the food taster for the king. And that's what he had. That's all he had. But he had access to the king's resources. He had access to the king's ear. He had something that he could offer. And so many of us, we look around and we say, well, what do I have? Here's this big problem. I can't possibly do something about that. And Nehemiah said, I will leverage what I have. So we all have something that we can contribute to the brokenness, to answer God's call to address the brokenness that exists in our world. But we're going to do more if we do it together. So I want to look at chapter 2 and continue the story and see what it means to do more together. So would you follow along in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 1? It came to pass in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, that I took the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had never been sad in the presence of the king before. Therefore the king said to me, why is your face sad, since you're not sick? This is nothing but sorrow of heart. So I became dreadfully afraid. And I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies waste and its gates are burned with fire? And then the king said, what do you request? I prayed to the God of heaven and I said, we'll pause there for just a moment. I want to look at some things that go into preparing for opportunities, because when it starts out and it says, it came to pass in the month Nisan, that doesn't mean much to us. We don't have the same kind of months as the Jewish calendar. But that was 4 months after Nehemiah heard about the problem back in Jerusalem. 4 months. So what do you think he was doing for 4 months? Was he sitting on his hands, wringing his hands? Somebody needs to do something about that back there. No, we know he was praying and planning for what was to come. He was praying and planning for the opportunity. When it came, he wanted to be ready. You see, it's one thing to expect a miracle, but it's not okay to wait for that miracle. I mean, we want to expect God to work. We want to expect God to intervene. But if all we do is sit around and wait for it, we sit on our hands and wait for something to happen, wait for the phone to ring, we have to put it into motion and do something about it. And so the timing, some factors involved in preparation that we learned from Nehemiah. One is timing. These 4 months go by. It wasn't idle time. Here in a few verses, we're going to learn the king's going to say, what do you want, Nehemiah? And he's going to have a list. I want this, this, and this. I want permission from you. I want you to buy the supplies that we're going to need. I want you to give me time off from work so I can take my team of people back there. I want you to give me protection, letters of protection. He's going to have this long list of things that he wants the king to give him. He wasn't sitting around idle. He was thinking about, what am I going to need for this project? And a lot of people have viewed earning a degree, they want to just get out there and do it. Or they view learning a trade as like kind of, I'm spinning my wheels. I don't have time for this. And Nehemiah teaches us that preparation and the timing is very important. And to invest the time, take the time to learn and grow ourselves and develop a skill. Now it says in verse 2, or the end of verse 1, related to timing as well, it says, when wine was before the king. So he was the wine taster. Can you picture what the wine taster for the king would be? An important role, because if he would taste it to make sure the king wasn't getting poisoned. So Nehemiah not only waited 4 months, he waited until the king was at his most trusting. When he brought the food into the king, and the king would be watching and hanging on Nehemiah. It also, not only timing, but courage is a big deal, because it says there that Nehemiah was sad before the king. Now put yourself in the king's seat for a moment, and your food and wine taster comes in and he's got a bad look on his face. What's he thinking there? That is not the guy you want sad in your presence. The food taster. And he looks sad and he's like, what's going on, Nehemiah? What's happening? Nehemiah, on the other hand, you don't ever get sad in the presence of the king. They hired people, jesters and such, to make them happy, to perform for them, to keep them all in good spirits and in a good mood. And he shows up all sad. Then he shows up with ideas, what he wants the king to do and what he wants the king to pay for. Notice at the end of verse 2, I have this phrase underlined. It says there, so I became dreadfully afraid. How many think courage means you're never afraid? It's not the case. Courage means I do it anyway, even when I am afraid. He's dreadfully afraid of this encounter with the king. He's about to ask the king for protection. He's about to ask the king for provision and such. Why did he do it? Why did he go through the anxiety and the worry of coming to the king so afraid? because the cause was worth it. The cause of rebuilding the walls and restoring Jerusalem to its dignity and its place of value and worth, a light to the nations. It was worth it. The cause was worth it. And one of the reasons that we don't step into the brokenness in our world, one, we're overwhelmed and intimidated by it, but another reason for some of us, we don't consider the cause worth it. Our own comfort and our own luxury and our own peace of mind is far easier and far more important to us than that. We want problems solved, just not often bad enough that they cost us anything. He was dreadfully afraid. Well, another thing it took for him was tact, because in verse 3, he says, he begins here, his wording is wise. May the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies waste? He said, may the king live forever. He said, King, I'm assuring you of my loyalty first of all. Whatever I'm about to say after this, you don't have to doubt my loyalty. You don't have to wonder about my loyalty. I'm on the team here. But the city of my fathers is in ruins. He did not say, the city of your rival has no defenses. He said, the city of my fathers is broken down. Tact. He also then gave him some plans, because in verse 4, the king says, what do you request? And he, over the next verses, he asks for time off, he asks for supplies, and he begins to ask for all those different things. And we find out later in the book that Nehemiah is gone 12 years. Talk about a leave of absence. But he asks the king, in your notes, if you're taking notes, he asks him for permission, he asks him for protection, and he asks him for provision. Think of that. He asks the king for time off. He says, I want to go rebuild the walls. And, king, by the way, I want you to pay for it. Verse 8, he says, I want a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he must give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel, which pertains to the temple, for the city wall, and for the house that I will occupy. He said, King, I want you to pay for it. I want you to give me a line of credit that I can buy lumber and rock and rebuild the city. So prepare. Let's not minimize the preparation side of things. We sometimes think that's wasted time. I need to just dive right into the work. And he takes time to prepare. Another thing Nehemiah did was he went to see for himself. Go see for yourself. We've had a number of people go on mission trips here through our church, overseas and domestic trips here in the U.S. One of the things that happens when they come back from a trip is they're different because now they've seen it. It sort of takes away the excuses. And somebody that's been in an international setting doesn't look at missionary pictures the same. Doesn't look at graphics like what are on that puzzle the same. Doesn't look at a world map the same. Doesn't look at their own stuff the same because they've seen what poverty looks like and they've seen what contentment with poverty looks like. Nehemiah arrives, verse 11. I came to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. And then I arose in the night, I and a few men with me. I told no one what God had put in my heart to do. And nor was there any animal with me except the one on which I rode. And he describes, starting in verse 12, a circuitous route around the city. He said, I went by the valley gate. Verse 13, I went out through the valley gate, and he describes all these things. And then in verse 15, he comes back to the valley gate. He goes clear around the city at night by himself, getting his own eye full of what the need is, of what the brokenness is that's going on there. We could say it like this: proximity always changes your perspective. When you get close, when you begin to understand, how many of you have perhaps formed judgments about another person, then you got to know them. And it's like, wow, I misjudged them. I was from a distance. I didn't really get to know them. I didn't really understand things. And now that I've gotten to know them, it makes more sense. Proximity defines and provides and gives us perspective. The closer you get, the better you see. And when you have enough courage to go and see for yourself, it's going to change how you lead, and it's going to change how you speak, and it's going to change how you think. In fact, we could say it like this: the more of us that get close to the brokenness that exists in our world, the more of an impact we will have. The more of us that get close to the brokenness, the greater our impact's going to be. But for too many of us, we have the volume turned up that makes too much noise. The entertainment's too loud so that we can't hear and see and understand the brokenness around us. Imagine what would happen if enough of us decided to get close enough to the brokenness in our world so that before we pass judgment and before we make a statement and before we offer solutions, we go see for ourselves. And I think if enough of us in this room would get close enough to what's happening, we'd be far more motivated to seek to do what seems impossible because we can do more together. If enough of us would get close to people of different socioeconomic backgrounds and those that are of a different color and those of special needs, we would begin to see things differently. Now, how do we do that? We want to give every person someone to show them who Jesus is. We place high value on children's and youth ministry here. We seek to alter the trajectory of a generation of young people so that generational sin doesn't get passed down, so that generational weaknesses and mistakes don't get passed down, so that there can be a renewal and a restoration. We're praying for a spiritual awakening here, given the brokenness that we're seeing around us, for God to awaken people to say, here's what's broken. Look at what's broken. The only solution is God. I say, let's give every kid and teenager an adult who will show them who Jesus is. How tragic that a county near us, that a county like ours, would have people get so desperately to the end of their rope that they choose some permanent solution for a temporary brokenness. Our community is full of kids, our area, who see brokenness everywhere. In their town, down the road, their classmates, in their own home. Their best shot at life is an encounter with somebody who loves Jesus and is willing to share that message with them. The best way that we can start rebuilding or rescuing or penetrating the culture of despair that exists is to put a consistent leader in the life of every kid. Look how verse 17 says it. Nehemiah finished his around the city tour. And he says to the leaders of the city, I said to them, you see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lies waste and its gates are burned with fire. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem that we may no longer be a reproach. How about the word we in there? Us. I have that underlined. Why would he say that? He's been living hundreds of miles away. Why would he say, look at the mess that we're in? There's an identification there that came out of him inspiring. So we're going to talk about inspiring others because we can do more together. So if we see some area of brokenness, some needs, imagine what we could do together compared to trying to do it ourselves. And so he rallies the people to inspire them. He says, take a look at what we're at. Verse 18, I like this one. I told them of the hand of my God, which has been good upon me, and also the king's word that he has spoken to me. He describes a competence that he has. He shows them how he's been planning and preparing. He has authority. He has credentials. He has materials. He's bringing some competence to bear to the problem. And then he identifies with them and their situation. There's an identification there. Look at the mess we're in. Look at the problems that we see. Let's work on this together. Let us build the walls. We're in this thing together. I'm not here to build the wall for you. I'm not some expert coming in telling you how messed up you all are. I love the definition of evangelism, which is one beggar telling another beggar where to find food. And that's who we are. That's why there's a humility about Christians, or there ought to be, because we're just one beggar who found some food, telling somebody else where to find peace and joy, forgiveness, restoration, and renewal. And it's found only in Christ. He describes the reality for them. The gates are burned. The city's in waste. This is reality. He doesn't present them some artificially phony picture. I heard somebody say once that you get used to something in a month. I want you to try this experiment between now and Faith in Action Sunday here in a few weeks. I want you to put something out of place, conspicuously out of place, where you're going to see it and have to walk around it for the next weeks. Because I heard somebody saying, it's kind of true, that we get used to something after a month. Now, I was thinking about that, and this week I saw in my house something. There was a nail that had held something in place, and that nail was there when we moved there 17 years ago. And I looked at it this week and I said, why does that nail exist? We have never used that nail. And it's still there. I hope this week I take it out. It amazed me that I've gotten used to that thing. So I want you to try that experiment and just see, because we can think of these Hebrews back in Jerusalem are like, man, what kind of lazy bums are they? They don't even have the sense to clean up around themselves. We get used to things after just a few weeks, and they got used to their brokenness. And tragically, far too many of us are used to the brokenness that exists in our world. We're just used to, that's just the way it is. So imagine if we said, what if we worked together? What could we accomplish? What kinds of things that we think are impossible could we accomplish together? And that's why we set about to have Faith in Action Sunday, which is 3 weeks from today, our one-day church-wide mission trip to the county, where we're beginning next week. We'll have you begin to sign up for projects around the county, some hands-on ministry that we're going to do. We're going to cancel our Sunday morning musical portion of the worship and the sermon, and we're going to go live it out. That's why we have a Say Yes board back in the lobby, full of opportunities for you to make a difference in a young person's life, so that we can do something about breaking the transgenerational curse of sin that we see going on so much around us. A change does not occur until people face the facts, until a leader presents reality. And then Nehemiah gives them a vision. Let's rebuild the walls, he says at the end of 17. And he even gives them a why, so we're no longer a reproach. Here's the grand vision. Here's what we're about. Let's do this thing together. So we're not a mockery anymore. Verse 18. I told them of what my God had done, and they said, let us rise up and build. And they set their hands to this good work. Let's start rebuilding. Let's put our hands together. Think what we can do together. Let's rise up and build. 2 closing thoughts that we're going to build on for next week. Everybody they needed for this project was already there. God has assembled people. I love how God brings people to this church. Whether you've been coming for a week or two, a decade or two, God brings people together for us to address the brokenness that exists. And everybody we need is here for us to be who God wants us to be and accomplish what he wants us to accomplish. Another thing about it, and I'm excited for next Sunday to talk about this. There were a lot of people doing things they were not experts at doing. There's a lot of people that are going to end up building walls that did not have construction experience. Sometimes you just have to do what needs to be done. Sometimes you just have to do what you don't know how to do because it needs done. Because we all started thinking, well, that's a great thing there, Joe, you're talking about, but that's not my gift. That's not my interest. That's not my ability. I don't really have that in me. And sometimes we have to do things we're not really all that good at because the wall's in rubble and the gates are burned and there's brokenness around us. And we have to figure this out. We can't be content with a full building. And we can't be content with our lives when there's brokenness going on around us. Would you bow your heads with me, please? There's been some here whose primary goal in life has been your comfort. And you've sought God out just so that he'll make your life better. And today, you feel compelled toward, you know what? There's a lot of brokenness that God's calling me to be a part of fixing. I see where God's called this church to be a part of that. I don't want to stand on the sidelines. And so it starts by your surrender to God. And then beginning to listen for opportunities and look for opportunities. See for yourself. Doing things you're not necessarily an expert at. Stopping by the yes board and saying, sign me up for something I'm not an expert at. I want to do something about the transgenerational brokenness. I'm going to start looking for a faith in action project where we could bless somebody with the love of Christ because it's their only hope. Heavenly Father, I pray that we come together to accomplish so much more than what we could accomplish individually. May you take this body of people, all of our different skills and interests and personalities and physical locations, and you draw people together so that we would be restorers of the breach, rescuers of the broken. The thought that you would use us as part of your restoration work blows us away, God. Thank you for letting us in on that. And I thank you for the dozens of people in whose heart you're at work just now. In Jesus' name, amen.